Good afternoon. So I've been asked to speak about the impact that being part of the recovery trial had on my experience of the pandemic and my recovery. Back at the beginning of the pandemic, which I suppose for those of us not involved in healthcare was around mid-March last year, I spent some time regretting some of my life choices, having gone into education rather than nursing like my sister did. This was because I had a constant feeling that must be something I could do, and I really wanted to do something to help, whether that was helping patients or helping people that were helping the patients. But I didn't have any relevant experience or qualifications, so I stayed at home and saved lives like we were told to do. Being allowed back into school, as I worked in a school, obviously, to work with children face-to-face was a relief, but I considered it to be a matter of when I got COVID rather than if. It finally caught up with me just in time for October half term last year. And as a natural born optimist, I spent 10 days telling myself everything was going to be fine, until the oxygen saturations proved otherwise, and I ended up admitted. It was around that time that I remembered an article I'd read about two rather smart gentlemen discussing the imminent wave of infection heading our way on the bus on the way to work. As I took my morning cup of pills, I remembered they'd quickly discovered how effective dexamethasone was and now made it standard treatment for COVID in patients. I was immensely grateful and felt lucky to be experiencing COVID 7 months into the whole thing with more treatment options available. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been to be one of the first wave. I'd been a guest at my local hospital for a couple of days before a doctor came to my cubicle with a handful of paper and a look of trepidation. She said she'd come to speak to me about a medical trial that was going on. And before she got much further than that, I eagerly agreed to be whatever kind of guinea pig she needed me to be. She clearly wasn't used to this level of enthusiasm, particularly from somebody who couldn't get to the end of a sentence without desaturating. Off she went to randomise me into one of the trial groups. Whilst I read through the information, I was most intrigued by the monoclonal antibody treatment, as I'd not heard of them before, and it just so happened that that was where I ended up. I'll never be able to say definitively whether they are what turned things around for me. All I can say is I went from feeling pretty unwell, and that discharge was a way off, to feeling like I was on the way to doing a bit better. And it wasn't that I suddenly felt completely fine, but I felt like I'd turned a corner and was on an upwards trajectory. One thing that stood out to me through my experience as a trial in a hospital was that it was all done by a small bunch of people who were clearly there purely to deal with the trial. It wasn't a case of overworked nurses, doctors and healthcare assistants, or surgeons, trying to do it alongside looking after patients. This was what they were there for, and that enabled them to put everything into it. Finally, I felt like I'd been able to contribute in some way. And it's not that I went out of my way to get COVID to be able to do that. I went home and didn't really give much thought to where my data had gone and what it was doing. A couple of months later, I responded to a call out for people who'd been on the trial to give some feedback that might help with recruitment for the trial in the future. This put me in touch with a lady called Caroline at Oxford University, and it seems I must have made an impression on her, as I've been her go-to girl for all things recovery related ever since. I had the honour of speaking on a webinar for Recovery's first birthday alongside Sirs Peter Horby and Martin Landray, and it was Caroline passing my information on to the Academy that has led me here today. The highlight of my pandemic experience, apart from still being here, was when in June it was announced that monoclonal antibodies were extremely effective against severe COVID. I was asked for new quotes for the press and told to keep it quiet, so I didn't even tell my kids. This led to my 14-year-old daughter getting up one morning, doing her usual check of the BBC app, and seeing a photo of me alongside the headline, "Another life-saving COVID treatment found." If you've never Googled yourself, I can highly recommend it, as at first glance it looks like I am the treatment. Being part of recovery has led me to become a patient ambassador for research at Calderdale and Huddersfield Trust, where I hope to be able to encourage others to take part in medical research. When I'm asked why I was so eager to take part in recovery, my answer is very simple. 1, I love science and I trust science. 2, I trust the NIHR completely. And 3, somebody has to do it. We all want better cancer treatments, better cold and flu remedies, better contraceptives. And for that, research has to happen. Someone somewhere has to put their faith in science and just do it. I'm more than happy to be one of those people, even happier to be in a room full of those who have a hand in research. So I can say face to face, I think you're amazing, I trust you, and thank you.
Good afternoon. Let me take you back to the BC era, where BC, of course, is before COVID-19, and then take one step further forward to January 2020, when the mainstream press was reporting the first cases of COVID-19 in the UK, and it became the focus of media attention. And this was a new disease, the mechanisms of which we did not understand. We did not understand its natural history. There were no treatments. There were no biomarkers apart from measuring viral load. And we were seeing that it was starting to have substantial morbidity, particularly in high-risk groups. There was an emerging public health crisis. And our community, our clinicians, our researchers across the country responded vigorously and in an exceptional way, facilitated by the work of our funding agencies, the National Institute for Health Research and the Medical Research Council. And what this graph shows you is it shows you the weekly COVID incident cases mapped onto an extraordinarily rapid response from the funding agencies and our community to come up with creative new ideas to understand and treat this condition, and for this to be peer-reviewed and funded within weeks. Never been seen before, extraordinary, and continued throughout the first 6 months of last year. Now, this led to a number of research studies being carried out, including in the therapeutic space, and by Easter 2020, things were being assembled quite nicely. On first impression, we'd seen the enthusiastic work from industry in partnership with some of our academic institutions to develop a vaccine program. We've heard about the recovery platform that was funded in that period of time, and also existing platforms such as the REMAP-CAP intensive care study, which was repurposed to address the COVID-19 challenge, and the community study principle also led out of Oxford, which was focused prior to that time on respiratory illnesses, which turned towards the COVID direction. And we were starting to explore the idea of having long COVID studies, post-hospitalization studies, prophylaxis. Now, this all happened within weeks, and as a consequence, it created a rather fragmented landscape with gaps. Because this had been a grassroots-up approach, there was no coherent treatment portfolio, and we actually saw competition for resources, not just financial resources, but resources such as recruiting sites in clinical trials, and indeed access to possible participants in clinical studies of the nature that we've just heard about. The rate of recruitment was extremely good, given the fact that the NHS was focused on healthcare delivery, but we realized it could be better. It was patchy, both in time and in place, and we saw that some unexpected sites, particularly district general hospitals, were doing exceptionally well, whereas other sites were not recruiting as fast to these national trials. And finally, we were relying largely on drugs that we already knew about, repurposed drugs. We didn't have a development pipeline, at least in the academic context. And so it was realized that this needed some form of reconfiguration and reorganization. The Government Office for Science led the way with the funders to try and address this. And so within a matter of 3 months, things changed dramatically. And by December 2020, the nationally funded platforms from phase 1 studies, where new medicines were first being tried in man, through phase 2 studies, which were testing a larger portfolio of agents for evidence of efficacy of mechanism and ensuring that they were safe in participants with COVID-19, through to the big definitive phase 3 studies that I've already alluded to. And we also saw activity in the prophylaxis space. In other words, what preventative medicines could we give to people at high risk from developing complications of COVID, and also started to think about the long COVID challenge. And so what is it that we've learned about clinical trials through this activity throughout 2020? Well, we've learned two main things in my view. One is that if you're going to assemble a national platform that is served in the whole country and being supported by the whole sector, you need to have an impartial approach to how you identify candidate drugs to feed into that in order to avoid duplication and make sure you get to the best agents in the fastest possible time. And this is why the Chief Medical Officer for England asked us to set up the COVID-19 Therapeutic Advisory Panel. And the key point about this is it was transparent and open, and it was focused on prioritizing drugs, not rejecting them, working out which were the best ones at that time that we should be trialing. It had an open web portal on the Department of Health and Social Care website, so anybody, a layperson, academia, industry, could nominate a candidate. There were 8 people, some of whom are here today, who were involved in the full panel of experts that looked at the evidence and took advice from a number of expert subgroups focused on important disease mechanisms that we thought were going to be important to treat in COVID-19. It was all serviced by a highly skilled due diligence team, which was rapidly seconded from the NHS, industry, and our universities to carry out the detailed scanning for information in the public sector and in the private sector to advise these subgroups about efficacy and likely treatment effects. And these subgroups advised the main CTAP panel, which made recommendations to all of the trial platforms we've discussed through Chris Whitty and the trial investigators. Over the year, we looked at 355 submissions, of which 228 were unique, and we produced detailed briefings on over 100 of those, which allowed us to make 30 recommendations into trials. This was all done virtually, and the 7 subgroup meetings met 47 times, and the CTAP main panel met, usually out of hours, about 16 times in that year, so that we could go through this information and continually revise the prioritized list as slots became available in the trials when recruitment was fast. This led to 7 drugs being recommended for NHS care and over 50,000 participants, one of whom was on my right, were recruited into these studies. It was genuinely national effort. It was diverse in terms of its representation across all 4 administrations, and we involved scientists across the whole country and many around the world. The second key learning point was the urgent public health prioritisation process, which was put in place by the National Institute for Health Research and chaired by Nick Lemoyne. This is essentially a way of working out which studies were most likely to have impact on COVID-19 and therefore should be supported by the National Clinical Research Network. You could apply, and these were reviewed rapidly. Within a week or so, the studies were identified as being a priority, and the CRN worked with the investigators to expedite recruitment into those studies and delivery with sharing of the information. And 101 studies were designated through this process. So what are the 6 lessons that I think we've learned from this? I think what this has shown us is that at a time of a pandemic, you need coordination and leadership to be efficient and effective and get answers that can have a benefit for the NHS and patients. You need to do this in a transparent way, which is independent and agile, responding to new data as and when it becomes available. Open data sharing is key, and the reason for this is because transparency and visibility engages stakeholders and builds public confidence, and data sharing of NHS data has been pivotal to the lessons we've learned through recovery, for example. As we've heard, embedding the trial within the NHS allowed trial delivery at scale, but it also led to implementation, often within days of a trial result being released. And having a coordinated staged approach where each part of the sector understands what the previous part is going to deliver and allows it to pull through fast also accelerates the rate at which you can advance your understanding. And do this at scale and keep it as simple as you possibly can. So it raises the provocative question as to whether or not we should be doing this beyond COVID-19. Should we be identifying priority areas beyond infection, beyond the pandemic, where this approach might work? And this is a question, an open question, which we may be able to discuss. I think key elements to this are that we need to understand the disease. We need to think about natural history from the outset. We need to think about centrally coordinating these trials across the whole landscape from first in man through to pivotal therapeutic phase 3 and phase 4 trials. We need a single system if we're going to do this at a national level to prioritize the best treatments, and that needs a skilled team. And we all have to agree what the rules of engagement are between each stage of the trial platform. That is not straightforward and was something we had to spend a lot of time working on. We have to work in partnership with the regulators, particularly the MHRA and the HRA, and critically ask ourselves what the risks are in our trial designs and what the risks might be if we tightly regulate those and therefore inhibit research from happening. This is a nuanced balance that we need to constantly think carefully about in order to accelerate progress in medical discovery in this space. And we've got to work with the commercial sector and co-design this platform so that we're open for business to work with them so that we can trial the most exciting medicines that are coming out of the commercial pipeline. And finally, we need capacity building. Many of our researchers were NHS clinicians during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they've returned to their normal duties now. So what are the perceived risks? Of course, this is not without risk. There are concerns that if you create platforms such as this, you're creating a cartel, and that might stifle innovation, and it may prevent challenge. You run the risk that you could have geographic or demographic restrictions in how you do your trials. And by prioritizing some areas, inevitably you're deprioritizing others. But I believe these three areas can be addressed if resourced appropriately and constructed in a way that fully engages the whole community. And the benefits? Well, we need to do this in a UK-wide manner, involving the devolved administration so we can deliver this at scale. We can improve the health of the nation, as we've heard, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of the treatments will be cheap, so we'll reduce NHS costs. Embedding it within the NHS and sharing data will lead to efficiencies in delivery, and we can show the world that we are global leaders in this, not just in delivering trials, but in how to deliver trials. This will, I anticipate, lead to inward investment, as we've seen, with large pharma coming to join our platforms and put their medicines into our platforms. And it also presents us with an opportunity to respond to the next challenge that we don't know about in our preparations for the unknown. Thank you very much.